It was a late summer evening, and the air was thick with the heat that still clung to the city, even as the sun dipped below the skyline. I had just finished a long shift at work and was looking forward to the quiet solitude of my apartment when I noticed her standing outside my neighbor's door. Her name was Clara, and she used to be with Jason, the guy who lived next door. They'd broken up a few weeks back, loudly enough for half the building to hear, and since then, I hadn't seen much of her. But tonight, there she was, leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her chest, looking like she was waiting for something. Or maybe someone. I couldn't quite tell. As I approached, she turned, her eyes catching mine in the dim light of the hallway. Her expression softened, and she gave me a small, tired smile. "Hey, Mark," she said, her voice a little husky. "You're getting home late." "Yeah, long day," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "What about you? Haven't seen you around much since." "Well, since everything," she shrugged, her gaze shifting down the hall toward Jason's door. "Just came by to pick up some of my stuff. But I guess he's not home." There was a pause, and then she sighed, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's weird, you know? Coming back here after everything." I nodded, not sure what to say. I had always liked Clara. She was funny and easy to talk to, and there was a warmth about her that had always drawn people in, including me. But she'd been Jason's girlfriend, and that had made her off-limits. Now, though, things were different. And as I stood there in the dimly lit hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind her words, something she wasn't saying. "Do you want to come in for a bit?" The question was out before I could think better of it, and I immediately regretted it, feeling like I had overstepped. But Clara just looked at me, a shadow of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Yeah, actually. That would be nice." We stepped into my apartment, and I offered her a drink, trying to shake the awkwardness that had settled between us. She accepted, and we sat together on my small couch, talking quietly as the city buzzed outside the window. At first, we stuck to safe topics: work, the weather, how she was adjusting to life without Jason. But as the night wore on, the conversation turned deeper, more personal. She talked about how she felt like she'd lost herself in the relationship, how she was struggling to find her footing again. And I listened, sharing a little more of myself than I usually did, telling her about my own struggles, the things I never talked about with anyone else. It felt strangely easy, like we were two people sharing the same loneliness, the same desire to be understood. At some point, the conversation slowed, and we sat in a comfortable silence, our glasses nearly empty. Clara leaned back against the couch, her eyes closed, and I found myself watching her, noticing the way the dim light softened her features, the way her hair fell loosely around her face. She opened her eyes and caught me looking, and for a moment, neither of us moved. There was something in her gaze that made my pulse quicken, something that felt like an invitation. "I should probably go," she said finally, but there was no conviction in her voice. She looked at me, her expression hesitant, as if she were waiting for me to say something that would change her mind. "You don't have to," I replied softly, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "You can stay a little longer if you want." Clara hesitated, her eyes searching mine, and then she let out a breath, a small, almost resigned smile tugging at her lips. "Okay, but can we go somewhere quieter? It's too bright in here." She glanced toward the door that led down to the basement, where I kept a few old pieces of furniture and some boxes I hadn't bothered to unpack. Without waiting for a reply, she stood and walked toward the basement door, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the frame as she glanced back at me. I followed her down the narrow stairs, my mind spinning with questions, with the sense that we were stepping into something we couldn't easily come back from. The basement was cool and dim, lit only by a small lamp in the corner that cast long shadows across the walls. Clara moved to the old couch by the far wall, sitting down and pulling her knees up to her chest, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. "Thanks for letting me hang out here," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's nice being around someone who doesn't expect anything from me." I sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance, but I couldn't ignore the way my heart beat faster, the way the air between us seemed charged with something unspoken. "You don't have to thank me," I said softly. I'm glad you're here. For a while, we just sat in the quiet, the sound of our breathing filling the small space. And then she turned to me, her eyes meeting mine in the dim light. Do you ever feel like you're just drifting? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. Like you're not really sure where you're supposed to go next? I nodded, understanding the feeling all too well.
Yeah.
More than I'd like to admit. She looked down at her hands, her fingers playing with a loose thread on her jeans. I'm sorry if I'm being too...
I don't know, Heavy.
I haven't really had anyone to talk to. You can talk to me, Clara, I said gently, reaching out without thinking, my hand covering hers. Her skin was warm beneath mine, and when she didn't pull away, I felt something shift between us, a current that flowed through that simple touch. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and searching, and then, before I could process what was happening, she leaned forward, her lips brushing softly against mine. It was the lightest of kisses, barely more than a breath, but it sent a jolt through me, a thrill that made my heart race. She pulled back, her cheeks flushed, her expression a mix of confusion and something deeper, something that mirrored what I was feeling. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I shouldn't have done that. But even as she said the words, I could see the question in her eyes, the same question that was burning inside me. I shook my head, my hand still resting on hers.
No. Don't be sorry.
It's okay. She hesitated, biting her lip, and then, as if some silent decision passed between us, she leaned in again, this time with more urgency, more need. I met her halfway, my hand slipping up to cup her face as our lips pressed together in a kiss that was soft but filled with all the things we hadn't said, all the things we'd been keeping inside. For a moment, we were lost in each other, in the warmth of that connection, in the way our bodies seemed to fit together so perfectly. But then, as the kiss deepened, reality crashed down around us, and I pulled back, breathing hard, my mind spinning with the weight of what we'd just done. Clara, we can't, I started, my voice rough with emotion, but she pressed a finger to my lips, silencing me. I know, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper.
But I don't want to think about that right now.
Just stay with me, okay? Just for a little while. I looked into her eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, the longing that matched my own. And against all my better judgment, I nodded, pulling her back into my arms, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. We kissed again, slower this time, savoring the closeness, the way her hands tangled in my hair, the way she sighed softly against my lips. We spent the night like that, wrapped in each other's arms on that old couch, sharing whispered confessions and stolen kisses. Every touch, every moment felt like a step deeper into a place we shouldn't have gone, but neither of us wanted to stop. And as the hours passed, I felt something change inside me, something I hadn't even realized I'd been missing. When the first light of morning filtered through the small window high on the basement wall, we finally pulled apart, the weight of what we'd done settling over us. Clara looked at me, her expression conflicted, and I knew that whatever happened next, we couldn't pretend this hadn't changed everything. I don't know where we go from here, she said softly, her fingers brushing against my cheek. But I don't regret it. I swallowed hard, my heart aching with the uncertainty of it all. Me neither. But we have to figure this out. We can't just keep pretending. She nodded, and I could see the same turmoil in her eyes that I felt in my own chest. We sat in silence for a while longer, our hands still entwined, knowing that the world outside was waiting for us and that there would be no easy answers. But for those few hours, in the quiet of the basement, we had found something we hadn't known we needed. And whatever came next, we'd face it together. We sat there in the dim light of the basement, the cool air wrapping around us like a cocoon. Everything above felt distant, almost unreal, like the night we had shared had taken place in a world separate from the reality waiting for us beyond those stairs. Clara's head rested against my shoulder, her hair soft against my cheek, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped, holding us in a place where nothing else mattered. But the quiet didn't last. Eventually, she shifted, pulling away just enough to look up at me. There was a sadness in her eyes, a question that neither of us seemed ready to answer. I tried to speak, to find the right words, but all that came out was a shaky breath. Her fingers brushed against my cheek, lingering, and I caught her hand, pressing it against my lips, trying to hold onto the closeness for just a little longer. "I should go," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence like a glass shattering. "Jason will be back soon and I don't know how to explain this." I nodded, even though every part of me wanted to ask her to stay, to keep holding onto this fragile connection we had found. But I knew she was right. We couldn't hide down here forever, pretending that the world outside wouldn't intrude. I stood up, helping her to her feet, and we made our way back up the narrow stairs, the morning light spilling into the hallway as I opened the door. Clara paused at the threshold, her back to me, and I saw her shoulders tense, as if she was bracing herself against the weight of what we'd shared. She turned, giving me a small, sad smile that twisted something deep inside me. "Thank you, Mark," she said softly, "for listening, for being there when I needed someone." I wanted to tell her that I'd always be there, that she could come to me whenever she needed, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, trying to hide the turmoil churning in my chest. She lingered for a moment longer, then turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing around the corner without looking back. When the door closed behind her, the apartment felt impossibly empty. I sank down onto the couch, staring at the spot where she'd been, my mind replaying every moment of the night, every touch, every whispered word. I knew that I should feel guilty. After all, Jason was my neighbor, and Clara had been his girlfriend. But all I could think about was the way her lips had felt against mine, the way she had looked at me like I was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Days passed, and I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the memory of that night. I avoided Jason as much as I could, keeping my interactions with him polite but distant. He seemed oblivious to the change, too preoccupied with his own life to notice that something had shifted between us. But every time I passed his door, I found myself listening for Clara's voice, wondering if she was inside, wondering if she ever thought about me the way I couldn't stop thinking about her. Then one evening, I came home to find her waiting outside my apartment again. She looked different this time, more guarded, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if she was trying to hold something in. When she saw me, she offered a small, tentative smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, Mark," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the hallway lights. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course," I replied, my heart leaping into my throat. I unlocked the door and led her inside, a sense of déjà vu washing over me as we stepped into the familiar quiet of my apartment. She didn't sit this time. Instead, she paced back and forth, her hands twisting together. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, her voice unsteady, "about what happened between us, about what it means." I stood there, watching her, my chest tightening with every word. "And?" I asked, barely able to keep the hope from my voice. She stopped, turning to face me, her expression raw and conflicted. "I don't regret it, Mark. I can't pretend that I do. But I also know that it's not fair to you or to Jason. I'm so confused. Part of me wants to just run away from everything, start over somewhere new. But then there's another part of me that just wants to be with you." Hearing her say those words, hearing that she felt even a fraction of what I had been feeling, sent a thrill through me, but it was tempered by the reality of the situation. I stepped closer, reaching out to take her hands, my thumbs brushing over her knuckles. "Clara, you don't have to make any decisions right now," I said gently. "Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're going through, I'm here for you. I want to help you, even if it's messy." She squeezed my hands, her eyes searching mine as if looking for reassurance. "What if it's too messy, Mark? What if we end up hurting everyone around us?" I took a deep breath, knowing that there were no easy answers. "Then we face it together," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "I can't promise that it won't be complicated, but I'd rather try to figure it out with you than keep pretending that I don't care." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression wavering between hope and uncertainty. Then, slowly, she leaned in, resting her forehead against my chest, her breath warm against my shirt. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close, feeling her relax against me as if she'd been carrying a weight she didn't know how to put down. For a while, we just stood like that, wrapped in each other's warmth, the world outside forgotten. But as much as I wanted to believe that we could stay in this moment forever, I knew that reality would catch up with us eventually. Clara pulled back, wiping at the tears that had gathered in her eyes, and I felt a pang of sadness as she stepped out of my arms. "I should go," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I need to figure out some things before we can decide what comes next." I nodded, my heart aching with the thought of letting her go. "Take your time, Clara. I'll be here when you're ready." She gave me a small, grateful smile, and then she turned and left, leaving me alone in the quiet of my apartment once more. But this time, the silence didn't feel as heavy. This time, there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was a future waiting for us on the other side of all this uncertainty. The weeks that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. Clara and I kept our distance, but every time I saw her in the hallway or caught a glimpse of her through the window, my heart would skip a beat. And late at night, when the world was still, I would find myself thinking about her, wondering what she was feeling, wondering if she missed me as much as I missed her. Then one night there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Clara standing there, her face pale, her eyes bright with something I couldn't quite name. She didn't wait for me to invite her in. Instead, she reached out, grabbing my hand, and pulled me close, her lips crashing against mine in a kiss that was desperate, urgent, filled with all the things we had left unsaid. We stumbled back into the apartment, the door swinging shut behind us, and I barely had time to process what was happening before she was pulling me down the stairs to the basement, just like that first night. Her hands were in my hair, her breath hot against my skin, and I couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but kiss her back, losing myself in the heat of her touch. When we finally came to a stop in the basement, she looked up at me, her chest heaving, her hands clutching the fabric of my shirt. "I can't keep pretending, Mark," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't want to lose you." Hearing those words, all the restraint I'd been holding onto snapped. I cupped her face in my hands, kissing her with all the longing, all the fear, all the hope that had been building inside me. She responded in kind, her arms wrapping around my neck, her body pressing against mine as if she was trying to erase all the distance that had kept us apart. We spent the night together, wrapped in each other's arms on that same old couch, the rest of the world fading into the background. It was messy, it was imperfect, but it was real. And as we lay together in the quiet darkness, our bodies tangled together, I knew that we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But for the first time, I didn't care about the consequences. All I cared about was the way she looked at me, the way she held onto me like I was the only thing keeping her anchored. And whatever came next, whether it was heartbreak or something more, I knew that I wanted to face it with her, no matter how complicated it might be. As the first light of dawn crept into the basement, Clara and I lay in each other's arms, the weight of the world pressing down on us. But for now, at least, we had found something that felt like hope. And in that fragile hope, there was a quiet promise, one that neither of us could put into words, but that we both felt deep in our bones. It was the promise that whatever this was, whatever it could become, we wouldn't run from it anymore. The morning light grew brighter, casting a warm glow over our tangled limbs. Clara stirred beside me, her head resting on my chest, her breath slow and steady. For a moment, I allowed myself to simply be, to soak in the sensation of her warmth, of her presence beside me. It felt like something I'd never truly had before, something I didn't want to lose. Eventually, Clara shifted, lifting her head to look at me. Her hair was tousled, her face flushed with sleep, and for a moment, she looked so vulnerable that it made my heart ache. I reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, and she caught my hand, holding it against her cheek. "What happens now, Mark?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, as if she was afraid that speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile peace we'd found. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts, but all I could think about was how much I didn't want to let her go. I don't know, I admitted, my voice rough with emotion. I just know that I don't want to lose you, Clara.
Not now.
Not after everything. She closed her eyes, leaning into my touch, and I felt her hand tighten around mine. I don't want to lose you either, she said, her voice cracking. But there's so much we have to figure out. So much that we can't ignore. I knew she was right. The world outside was waiting, with all its complications, all its expectations. There was Jason, the questions he would ask, the judgment that would follow, if anyone found out. And yet, as I looked at Clara, at the uncertainty in her eyes, I realized that I was willing to face all of it if it meant I could be with her. Then we take it slow, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We don't have to make any big decisions right now. We just see where this goes. Clara's expression softened, and she gave me a small, tentative smile. I think I'd like that, she said, her voice barely audible. One day at a time. I kissed her then, a soft, lingering kiss that felt like a promise. When we finally pulled apart, she rested her head against my chest again, and I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close as the morning light continued to fill the room. For the next few hours, we stayed in that basement, talking about everything and nothing, sharing the small details of our lives that we'd never shared before. It was as if the world outside didn't exist, as if we had carved out a space where we could be ourselves without fear or judgment. And in that space, I found a kind of peace that I hadn't realized I was missing. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, reality began to creep back in. Clara sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair, a look of determination settling over her features. I should go, she said softly, glancing toward the stairs. I need to talk to Jason. I need to end things properly. A knot tightened in my chest, but I nodded, knowing that this was something she had to do. I understand. Just promise me you'll come back when you're ready. Promise me you won't disappear. She met my gaze, her eyes filled with something that looked like hope and fear all at once. I promise, Mark. I'm not going anywhere. With those words, she stood, pressing a final, lingering kiss to my lips before making her way up the stairs. I watched her go, my heart aching with the uncertainty of what lay ahead, but also with a strange sense of relief. Because even though the future was unclear, even though we had no idea what challenges we would face, I knew that we had taken a step towards something real. The days that followed were filled with a tense kind of waiting. I went about my routine, trying to keep busy, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Clara, to the way she had looked at me that morning, to the promise she had made. I wondered how her conversation with Jason had gone, wondered if she would come back to me the way she had said she would. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Clara standing there, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but there was a new strength in her expression, a determination that I hadn't seen before. "Hi," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I talked to Jason. It was hard, but I told him the truth. I told him that I need to move on. I stepped closer, reaching out to take her hand, my heart pounding in my chest. And how did he take it? She looked down, her fingers tightening around mine.
Not well.
But he'll be okay. He deserves to find someone who's all in, and I can't give him that anymore. I nodded, pulling her into my arms, feeling the weight of everything she had just shared settle between us. You did the right thing, Clara. And I'm proud of you. She buried her face in my shoulder, her breath warm against my neck, and for a long moment, we just stood there, holding on to each other, as if we could keep the world at bay. When she finally pulled back, there was a softness in her eyes, a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what comes next, but I know I don't want to be alone tonight." I smiled, my chest tightening with relief. "Of course, Clara. You're always welcome here." She stepped inside, and as I closed the door behind her, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a sense that, whatever the future held, we would face it together. It wouldn't be easy. There would be mistakes and missteps, and there would be moments when the weight of what we'd done would feel too heavy to bear. But as I looked at Clara, at the way she smiled through her tears, I knew that some things were worth fighting for. We spent that night in each other's arms, sharing the kind of closeness that felt both fragile and unbreakable. We talked about our fears, our hopes, our plans for the future, and even though neither of us had all the answers, it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. In the months that followed, we took things slowly, navigating the complicated tangle of our pasts and the uncertain future that lay ahead. There were days when it felt like everything might fall apart, when the weight of our choices threatened to pull us under. But there were also moments of joy, of laughter, of quiet understanding that made all the struggles feel worth it. And as time went on, I realized that what Clara and I had found in that basement, what we had built together, wasn't just a fleeting connection born out of loneliness and desire. It was something deeper, something real, something that made me believe that we could find a way to make it work. We still didn't have all the answers. We still had a long way to go. But as we faced the world together, hand in hand, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. And in the end, that was all that really mattered.